All right, you guys. So this is part two of the lecture. So once you have identified these four figures in your Google Doc, then you can go ahead and continue on here with the remainder of the lecture. So our main idea for today is isolationism. If you guys remember from the lead up to World War I, as well as other points in American history, we've been a rather isolationist country at this point. Americans in the 1930s wanted to avoid another world war. World War I is viewed as something that was very costly, not necessarily beneficial to the US, and something to be avoided. Also, it kind of predates or goes back to the whole idea of the Monroe Doctrine that European affairs are up to Europe, right? That's their deal, and whatever's going on in the New World is our deal. And so Americans in general wanted to avoid going to war. And so in the build-up to World War II, Roosevelt took a variety of actions in order to try to prevent another war from happening. In 1934, he formally recognized the Soviet Union, the USSR, in an attempt to sort of appease Stalin, also potentially maybe to set an example for other European nations to try and, again, keep peace between the Soviet Union and the rest of the world. Remember, at this point, the Soviet Union and Stalin were seen as a much bigger threat to world peace than Hitler or Germany. He then issued the good neighbor policy with Latin America, essentially saying, hey, Latin America, sorry for everything we did to you during the early 1900s, late 1800s. We won't get involved in your affairs anymore. Again, trying to maintain peace and keep people on our side. He reduced tariffs, going back from those high tariffs of the early 1930s under Hoover, again trying to ease up on those trade wars that had plagued the early 30s. And then finally in 1935, Congress passed the Neutrality Act of 1935, which essentially said that the U.S. would not sell weapons to any nation at war. The idea here being that any nation at war will look to the U.S. for help. Remember, at this point, the U.S. was the manufacturing capital of the world. And so without U.S. support, especially with weapons, the idea was that potentially some nations would think twice before going to war, knowing that they could not lean on the U.S. for support. At the same time, things were getting more aggressive in Europe. Hitler began to build up the German army, which violated the Treaty of Versailles. He was limited to a very small standing army, which he then promptly broke. But very clearly, no nation was willing to enforce the Treaty of Versailles. And so as Hitler saw that nations like France and Britain weren't going to do anything about what he did, he started to push the envelope a little bit more. Mussolini then joined the party by attacking Ethiopia in 1935. The League of Nations issued a boycott in Italy, which proved to be ineffective, and again started to show the weakness of the League of Nations in preventing a war from happening. In 1936, Hitler sent German troops to the Rhineland, which was a region in which he was prevented or not allowed to have troops stationed, but he did so anyway, again showing this sort of pushing that he was doing, trying to test how far he could go with the Allies. And then in 1936, Hitler would sign an alliance with Italy and Japan, thus creating the foundation for the Axis powers. And again, no country is going to take any sort of action against Hitler or Germany, leading to this idea of appeasement, which is kind of allowing something to happen in order to prevent something worse from happening. In 1936, we have the Spanish Civil War, in which General Francisco Franco sought to gain control of Spain. Both Hitler and Mussolini sent supplies, weapons, airplanes, tanks in order to help out Franco, create a fascist regime in Spain. This was done as a sort of testing ground for the new technologies that the Nazis and the Italians had developed in the 1930s, leading up to World War II. Germany then forced, essentially, Austria to sign the Anschluss, or to annex Austria and make Austria part of Germany. Again, this violated the Treaty of Versailles with regards to Germany expanding its borders. This happens in 1938. And then Hitler invades the Sudetenland, which was a region, a border region of Czechoslovakia, which had many German speakers. Now, while all these things were happening, Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of Britain at the time, was essentially saying, hey, Hitler, you're not supposed to do that, but not really doing anything concrete. So in 1938, he and Hitler agree to meet at the Munich conference, and they come up with a sort of agreement, so to speak. Now, at this point, Chamberlain was opposed by Winston Churchill, at this point a member of parliament, who was saying that appeasement was not the right idea, that we have to do something, we have to go to war, we have to try to stop Hitler before it gets worse. But Chamberlain, again, being pushed on by this sort of um, anti-war sentiment that was pervasive throughout the world, was trying to push on with the appeasement idea. Hitler promised, quote unquote, no further expansion. Chamberlain returned to Britain and basically announced that he prevented World War II from happening. But in the end, we will see that this appeasement policy would not actually be successful in preventing a war from breaking out. Here we see Guernica, which is a very famous painting by Pablo Picasso done in 1937. It depicts the bombing of a town called Guernica during the Spanish Civil War by some Nazi-supported bombers. For me, this painting really speaks to the horrors of war, especially the new kind of mechanized war that was brought about in the 20th century. Again, a new type of war in which you don't know who you're fighting. You don't know who's attacking you until a bomb drops on you or you're shot by a machine gun. And I thought that Picasso did a really excellent job of kind of capturing that sentiment in this painting here. So again, here we see Chamberlain, Churchill. Chamberlain would be prime minister until 1940, when Churchill would take over once World War II has broken out. So how does the US respond to these acts of aggression in Europe? Well, we continue by passing more neutrality acts. In 1936, we passed the Neutrality Act of 36, which says that we still won't sell weapons to nations at war, but we also won't lend out any money. Again, trying to reduce the incentives for going to war, or the potential incentives a nation at war would have in getting US support. The 1937 Neutrality Act created the cash and carry policy, which said that buying anything besides weapons, you can't buy weapons, right? But if you want to buy any sort of supply for war, uniforms, food, whatever, you have to cash and carry it, essentially meaning that you have to buy it in cash, right? We won't give it to you with any sort of loan or IOU, and you must carry it on your own ships. So US ships will not sail to nations at war. Again, trying to make it harder for any nation to go to war because they will not have US support. So we now know that appeasement was a bad policy, or at least that it didn't work. But at the time, it was considered to be a good idea. So in your Google Doc, just jot down in 2 to 3 to 4 sentences, why do you think it was considered a good idea at the time? So again, hopefully you've paused and done that before moving on. But in terms of why appeasement was considered to be a good idea, there's kind of 4 main reasons. Number 1, there was fear that it would create war, the kind of most obvious reason. Number 2, there was a worldwide peace movement that happened after World War I. Nations signed something called the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which was a worldwide agreement, which essentially said that war was illegal, which is, to a degree funny, but it basically proved that there was a very sincere attempt to try to prevent another world war from happening. Number 3, the Great Depression was a bigger deal. Many people were more focused on that rather than anything happening in Europe. I remember Hitler wasn't viewed as much of a potential problem as he turned out to be. And so when he was doing these things, people were more focused still on the Great Depression. And finally, many leaders saw the Soviet Union as a much bigger threat than Hitler. And so Stalin was viewed as much more caution than anything Hitler was doing. And actually, Hitler was potentially viewed as a barrier to Soviet expansion, and so therefore not necessarily an issue. So appeasement then ends and war begins. Germany invades Czechoslovakia in the spring of 1939. Hitler then signs a non-aggression pact with the Soviets, essentially saying that they would agree to split up Eastern Europe and not fight each other. Germany then invades Poland in the fall of 1939, and by early 1940, once Germany invades Poland, this is when the other nations, France and Britain, declare war. Germany then, before being able to be stopped by France or Britain, they invade and capture Denmark, Norway, and the Netherlands. France and Britain go to war, but by June of 1940, for a variety of reasons beyond just the French being the French, the French surrender, and essentially Great Britain is fighting World War II by itself. And at this point, remember, the U.S. is passing all these neutrality acts, so we can't even help out Great Britain. Well, in 1940, Roosevelt runs again for an unprecedented third term, which at the time was not necessarily against the Constitution. He wins, as you can see, by a rather large margin against Willkie, the Republican, and he gets a third term. With his third term, he wants to help out the Allies. Congress isn't letting him, though, because of the Neutrality Acts. And so in the early 1940s, FDR is mostly trying to kind of scale back what Congress has done to try to help out the British. In 1939, he is able to convince Congress to scale back the Neutrality Acts by saying, okay, cash and carry is still here, but we can sell weapons as long as they are cash and carried. So again, trying to find ways to sell weapons to Britain. However, Britain would very quickly run out of cash. And so then Roosevelt pushes for the destroyers for bases deal, in which Britain would get destroyers, warships from the US in exchange for for America being able to use British bases in the various oceans. Again, we didn't need those bases, but it was a way to give these destroyers, these ships, to Britain in order to keep them afloat before the US joined the war. FDR then replaced any important cabinet member that opposed his vision of helping out the British in these early stages of World War II. Again, this is very similar to his court packing plan. Then in 1940, we have the Selective Service Act, or a peacetime draft, in which 16 million men are registered for the draft. And you have to think to yourself, why are we registering 16 million men if we're not going to war? Very clearly, Roosevelt has in mind that we're going to go to war eventually, and we better be ready for it. In 1941, Roosevelt then convinces Congress to pass the Lend-Lease Act, which essentially makes the U.S. no longer neutral. It allows the U.S. to lend or lease weapons to Britain, or the Soviet Union, which at this point had been betrayed by Hitler. You have to kind of think about the fact that if you lend or lease out a weapon, it probably won't come back to you in the same condition. It was essentially a way for the U.S. to keep the Allies afloat until the U.S. could join the war. Then Churchill and FDR met off the coast of Newfoundland in what became known as the Atlantic Charter. They kind of drew up their goals for the post-World War II world. Again, you have to think about, if the U.S. is not yet at war, and we're meeting with Churchill discussing the goals of the war, what is the implication here? Well, the implication is we're going to go to war. And again, once Stalin gets betrayed by Hitler, the U.S. would also lend its support to Stalin through the Lend-Lease Act. As we see here, many, many billions of dollars, in fact, $48 billion were given out to various allied nations throughout World War II in an attempt to keep them afloat while the war was going on. And that brings us to the end of today's lesson. So the essential question for today, the one that you will be answering in about a paragraph on your Google Doc, is to what extent was the U.S. isolationist in the 1930s? So think about the various acts that were passed, the Neutrality Acts, think about cash and carry, think about the build-up to World War II. To what extent were we isolationist? And so your answer can range from 100% isolationist to 0% isolationist, or probably somewhere in the middle. And make sure to kind of support your answer with some sort of evidence as well as some reasoning. All right, I hope you guys enjoyed, and good luck.